Hello, I'm Dr. Ron England, and today we're going to talk about arrays. And specifically, I'm going to talk about arrays, and this is arrays in C#, in the context of plotting. So I have an object that I'm using here called the highcharts.net plotting object, and it actually takes as an argument arrays. So for the x-axis, it has a property called categories, and the property called categories requires an object array. So in the default example given with the highcharts.net plotting routine, it creates this by using the new with the brackets to declare that it's an array, and then the values are actually set explicitly, with the syntax being the open brackets, then each of the individual objects in the closed brackets. To set the y values, you do the same thing essentially, but the y values actually, because you can have more than one y series, they have this object called a series, which has a property called data, and that property called data requires an object array. And in this case, the object array is an array of values which then correspond with the x-axis values, and it allows you to do the plot. And in the end, the plot's going to look something like this. Here's the series, here's the numbers that go with that series. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd actually like to plot an equation here. So I'm going to show you how to take this and just do some modifications that make it relatively easy to plot an equation. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to develop what the equation is going to be. So if we look down here, I've created a function called quadratic, which returns a double, and it requires an x, a, b, and c values. Now I need to get those a, b, and c values. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add to the plot a text box for a, b, and c. Okay. What I've also like to do here is I'd like to have it run from 0 to another number and by a specific step. So I'm going to go ahead, and I notice I set default values for these. I'm going to add two more text boxes, last and step, and I'm going to set the first value to be 0. Okay. So let's go back over to my plot example here, and let's see how I can set up those x values so that they can be the x values of the axis. Well, I know that I need an object array, but what I saw here was that I actually had a string array, so I'm going to create my x values as a string array. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the first value that I'm going to plot is 0, then the last value I'm going to plot I'm going to get from that text box, and then I'm going to do it by a step that I also can set, by the user can set, from that text box. So I know that the number of values that will be in the array will be last minus first divided by step. That's the n. And I can set up a new string array to be that, declared to be that size n. So my variable x here is of size n. Well, my function that I have here, which is private, returns a string array, and the name of the function is x values. So what I'll do is I'll say I'm going to go from 0 to n. I'm going to set up an integer loop for I equals 0 to n, incrementing I by 1, and I'm going to set my x to be equal to a string by converting to a string the first value plus I times step. That'll actually can move it step by step, starting at the first value. Now I could have easily just have made first also something that was a variable, but in this case I just want to plot from 0. Okay, so that's going to return me an array, which will be a string array of my x values. And so what I want to do is I'm going to comment out my default line that came with the plotting routine, and I'm going to uncomment my line where I actually set the categories to be equal to those x values. Notice that I get a warning here to tell me that I'm doing an implicit conversion from string to object, and it could cause a problem. Okay. Now in this case I know that it won't cause a problem, but if I really wanted to be explicit, I would just simply make this to be an object array. I'm not doing that because I want to show how to actually create object arrays and arrays of type string, and an array of actually anything. So let's go back down here now. I've got these x values. Now I need to set the y values, and the y values, as you see here, were a series of numbers. They were numeric. Okay, but if you look at the way the declaration worked, it was declared as an object array of y values. So let's come down here. Well, how do I do that? I'm going to make another function that is going to return an object array. Notice my object array that tells me that the function returns an object array called y values, and it's going to accept as an argument a string array of x values. Now because I'm going to be doing the quadratic equation here, I'm going to go ahead and get back the values for A, B, and C in the quadratic equation from the page, which is in text box A, text box B, and text box C. So now I have values for A, B, and C that I can use for my equation. I'm going to set my Y, which is going to be an object array, to be the same size as my X array. So X values.length will be what I use to set the number of dimensions of my object array. And now I'm going to loop through it again. I equals 0 to the X values.length. Okay, I'm going to set the value of X to be equal to the value of X values of I. Okay, and I'm going to convert that to a double because I want to use it in a calculation. I set my Y, okay, of each individual array element to be equal to the quadratic, what I get from actually running the function quadratic, and then I return my object array. So let's look at this. Let's go ahead and comment out this one, the old one, and let's uncomment the one that I'd like to use. Now what am I doing here? I'm setting the data to be equal to the Y values, which will be the results of what you get back when you run that function, passing it the X values, okay, that you got also. Now I could, of course, take an X values, set it to be equal to a variable, and then use the variable so I wouldn't have to call it multiple times. But in this case, I really don't care. It's not going to take up that many computation cycles. Okay, so now let's take this whole thing and let's run it. So if I go ahead and start the thing up and running, and you can actually look through the code. Now this code of working with arrays is code that every programmer should really understand. Okay, you do need to know how to work with arrays. Okay, what this is going to look like is there's my plot right there, a beautiful plot of my quadratic. My A, B, and C, which I didn't make anything fancy for putting these text boxes in, were all set to 1, and my last number was 10, and my step was 1. But please note that instead of running from 1 to 10, it actually ran from 0 to 9. Why? Well, because the array is 0 indexed. It starts at 0 and it goes up through the number that's going to be n minus 1. Okay, or the number of the last number minus 1. Now I can easily fix that in my calculation. That's a simple fix. I simply add that step of 1 in there. But remember, I told it to start at 0. Now, what if I change the value here? Let's say if I make A equal to 2, and then I replot it. Okay, well now I'm going to plot. Now, the reason it plots both of these is when I went in here and did my series, I'm simply adding a new series to this. I didn't get rid of the old series. I didn't clear out any data. It's actually also replotting the X values too. But in the case of replotting the X values, they're exactly the same. Okay, I can also plot a third one here. Say, let's do -3, and let's make B equal to 4. Okay, now I replot, and now you're going to have a plot that diverges in the other direction there. Okay, so you can see how this quadratic is being calculated, how the whole thing goes together. But the big thing to understand about this lecture is that I'm simply showing how to use arrays to put values, to calculate values, and put them into the plot, and the types of arrays that you need to have. What is important is that you need to know if you're using a routine that requires an array, you need to create the array, but you also need to be able to use the right type of array. So hopefully this will work for you. Good programming. Thank you very much.